Okay, so to warm up today's lesson, or I should say to warm up for today's lesson, on checks and balances, I want you to think about this situation. What would happen if you had one person controlling the gas pedal, another the brake pedal, and another steering the car? Do you think it would go well? Or do you think it would be pretty challenging? So the key that I want you to think about here is you'd have to go pretty slowly, and you'd have to have a lot of communication, correct? And you'd have to get a lot of people on the same page, or else you couldn't do it very effectively. And I think this is a good analogy for what our government is really doing here when they're broken up into three different branches. We have executive, legislative, judicial. In order for anything to occur and for the car to actually travel effectively, everybody has to work together. And that's really the case here. Our target for today. I can explain how checks and balances keep the legislative, executive, and judicial branches from becoming too powerful, or really from becoming a tyranny within any of the three branches. See, that's the key here that we always need to think about here. We're trying to avoid a tyranny. We're trying to avoid a government that becomes too powerful and overwhelming. And hopefully we are doing that. When you look at it, there is supposed to be balance in our government between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, where none is supposed to be more powerful than the other. And that's a key thing to understand here. So what we're trying to do is make them so they're equal, so they can keep each other in check. So they should balance here on our little seesaw. So this is our seesaw of awesomeness. We have Chuck Norris on one side. Would it be balanced with a bird on the other side? I'd say probably not. How about if we add in Cyclops? Nah, what if we add in the moon? Okay, maybe. Now let's say we put Chuck Norris on the other side now here. What happens? Do we have good balance here? Or, yeah, Super Wilson, I don't know, let's see. Maybe too powerful for them, I guess. But there's our target. Don't worry, they're okay. It's very soft. On to checks and balances here. So our background is this. The Founding Fathers wanted to avoid becoming like Britain. That would be the worst thing possible. And power was divided in many different ways. With federalism, which is federal, state, local, and three branches within each of those different levels of government, being the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Raise your hand if this sounds familiar to you. Okay, good. Raise your hand if you just raised your hand while watching a video and there's no teacher in the room. I got you again. There we go. I'm proud of myself for that one. Okay, powers of Congress, which is the legislative branch here. So Congress may feel like, yeah, we're the man. We're pretty strong, really powerful. We can do whatever we want because they can do a couple big things. Number one, they can make laws or pass laws. That's the main job of the legislative branch. And beyond that, they can also appropriate money, which deals with levying taxes and then determining where that tax money is going to be spent and which agencies and which people get that money. Pretty important power here. Because of this, they may feel like they're, super strong, super powerful, and way more powerful than the other branches. But in reality, there are a lot of checks that are going to keep the legislative branch in check here. Checks in check. Man, that might be too many checks, huh? But there are some things here that are going to keep the legislative branch from doing too much and becoming too powerful, because that's what we don't want to have happen. So the executive branch, what can they do? First off, they can propose laws, which is a power of the legislative branch, which may seem like, who cares? That's not a big deal. It's supposed to be approved by the legislative branch. However, if the president proposes a law and pushes for it to get passed and uses his publicity and his public image to do that, that actually is pretty powerful. The president can also veto laws. If he doesn't like a law that's passed, he can veto it, and that's really, really important to understand. Also, the president can force Congress into a special session. In other words, make them meet. If they're not working together and they're not resolving certain conflicts, the president can make them go and do that. On the other side, we have the judicial branch, which can declare any new law unconstitutional, any law at all. So if the legislative branch loves it and passes it and every single person in the entire Congress agrees to it, but it seems like it violates the Constitution, the judicial branch can chop it down and say, nope, you can't do that. So while the legislative branch may feel like they are the most powerful branch, they are just one branch. They are powerful, but they do have checks that are going to keep them in place. On to the second branch here, which is the branch of the president, the executive branch. Let's talk about the president and what he can do. The president can veto laws, very important power, right? So he can say, no, don't like that, it's gone. He can also negotiate treaties with foreign countries. Could be after a war, could be at a time of peace, but go in and negotiate treaties and agreements on how we want to deal with other countries. He is also the commander-in-chief. In other words, he's the head of the military. Really important thing. He can also appoint ambassadors and Supreme Court justices. So it's the president's pick as to who's going to fill these very, very, very important roles. So the president may feel like he's like this super, Elvis Presley, John Travolta looking man guy. But, yeah. Let's see. What keeps him in check? First off, the legislative branch. They can override the president's veto with a 2/3 vote in both houses. So if the president vetoes a law, then it still could become a law or veto a bill, it still could become a law if both the House of Representatives and the Senate pass that law with a 2/3 vote. Second, the president also can negotiate treaties. However, it takes the legislative branch, and more specifically the Senate, to ratify treaties. So a really good example here from history, Woodrow Wilson, who was the president during World War I, at the end of the war, goes over to Europe, and he provided his plan of what he thought would be a great way to not only resolve the issues at the end of the war, World War I again. However, it was also on how we can kind of keep the world from ever having this occur again. He came with what was known as Wilson's 14 points. It was this, and I'm being very serious about all this too, by the way. And he has all these great ideas. Everybody seems like they like them overseas. He brings them back to America, and they're like, "Yeah, we're not going to do that." Senate wouldn't ratify it. Our own government wouldn't vote for our president's ideas. So it's important to understand that really, while the president can make a lot of decisions, he needs approval on just about everything that he can do. So the president's the head of the military, but he needs the Congress to declare war. And the one key thing I want to say about this is that it seems like it's a little bit inaccurate because Congress hasn't declared war in a very long time, the Senate again, but in a very long time, that the president, or really I shouldn't even say the president, but the armed forces have been overseas fighting in Vietnam and Korea and all these different locations. Well, the reality is that there is, I don't want to say a loophole, but there kind of is a loophole which allows for the president to use soldiers in times of need, let's just say. Finally, the legislative branch also approves presidential appointments, whether it be to the Supreme Court or to the or as ambassadors. So it really takes the approval of the legislative branch to do a lot. And the legislative branch can impeach and remove the president. While this hasn't happened in history, it could happen theoretically. And you're like, "What are you talking about, Mr. Wilson? Richard Nixon, he was impeached and removed." And the answer is no, he was not. He resigned prior to impeachment trials and charges being filed against him. So that's an important thing to look at here. So with the whole impeachment process, there have been a couple cases in which presidents have been impeached. The closest one to an actual removal was Andrew Johnson. Shortly after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the Congress did not get along well with Andrew Johnson, and they kind of set him up to break a rule so that they could impeach him and remove him from office, and they were very, very, very close to doing so. And the other group that can check the executive branch is the judicial branch, and they can declare the acts of the executive branch to be unconstitutional. They can say, "Hey, you executed the law in a way that you weren't really allowed to do that." For instance, in the Miranda case, the Supreme Court ruled that since the police and members of the executive branch interrogated Ernesto Miranda in an unconstitutional manner, in other words, without telling him what his rights were, that meant they couldn't use evidence against him. So it's really overpowering what the actions were of that executive branch. So while the president may feel like he's the most powerful man in the world and he can do anything he wants, even fly, he is actually just, well, a man. And he's very powerful, though. That's the thing I want to say. He's just a man, and he's a very important person. But his branch of government is designed to be only as powerful as the other ones. So he's the most powerful man in the executive branch, maybe in the country, and probably in the country. However, still checked. Finally, we have our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court here, Mr. John Roberts, and let's look at the judicial branch. Their roles, number one, they are to determine the constitutionality of any law or action taken in the government. In other words, does this follow the Constitution? That's a key idea to think about here with the judicial branch. Does it follow the Constitution? Does it follow the law? That's all they're really supposed to do. They also hear disputes between states, and they can hear any appeal that comes to them. So those are some important things. They may feel like, yeah, really big, really powerful. But there are some checks. First off, and remember what I said to you, the job of the judicial branch is to interpret the Constitution. That's the number one priority. So how can you overpower a decision made by the judicial branch? Like, let's say, for instance, in the Dred Scott Supreme Court case, it basically came out that the Supreme Court felt that slavery should not be banned anywhere. It was never intended to be banned, and therefore anywhere in America, anybody can bring their slaves. And this was something that was very controversial, and it caused a lot of problems in America. So how can we overturn that? Well, it's pretty simple. You change the Constitution. And you're thinking, you can't do that. Well, actually, you can. That's what an amendment is. It's amending the Constitution. It's changing the Constitution. So in order to overpower a Supreme Court decision, a new amendment can be passed. Another thing is the legislative branch in conjunction with the executive branch, and I'll just kind of put an arrow here while we're talking about it. They appoint from the executive and approve from the legislative branch all federal judges and also Supreme Court justices. So it's very important to understand how that works because they both do work together on this to determine who's going to be in the judicial branch, which is the other branch. And finally, the legislative branch, if needed, could impeach Supreme Court justices if they did something illegal, though that's not something that is commonplace. Finally, the executive branch actually has another power, which is kind of crazy, and we haven't discussed this at all yet, and that's the ability to pardon federal offenders. In other words, if the president looks and says, hey, that person's in jail, and they shouldn't be in jail, like they didn't really commit a crime, it's not a big deal, they could actually get them off the hook and pardon them of their crime. So pardoning is one version of this. There's also granting clemency, which is lessening the sentence of somebody. So they could say, okay, you have 50 years, we're going to drop you down to 2 years. And by the way, that seems like a little bit goofy of a power to give. But the point is we want to make sure that everybody's held in check. So the biggest powers are held in check by somebody else just in case somebody goes a little bit too far with what they should have done. And in this case, it's if the Supreme Court or any federal court goes a little bit too far with their interpretation that doesn't really fit and make sense to what the normal person would think. So, Chief Justice John Roberts got his power, and actually I shouldn't even put President Obama there. It should really be former President Bush, since he was the one who appointed him. But nonetheless, Chief Justice John Roberts says, now that I have the power of the law, I can do anything I want with it, and nobody can stop me. And the Congress says, actually we can impeach you if you abuse your power, so don't get too excited. And that is recognized, and John Roberts says, I guess that does limit my power. So what is the moral of the story here? Each branch might think that they are much more powerful than the others, but the reality is that, well, they are held in check. So the branch has superpowers. And while they are all each strong, it takes working together and being on the same page and moving slowly for our country to move forward. It's not like our country is not designed in a way to make decisions super quickly on most things. It's more about let's deliberate, let's make sure this is the right decision. And that's actually a good thing for us overall because it helps us to avoid making really serious, significant mistakes that could negatively impact our country as a whole. So I hope that made sense to you. And if you want, let's try out a little bit of an activity here in which you write a story in which Super Olson is the president, Chuck Norris is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Team 2 is the Congress, and look at how one group overstepped their power and was put back in place by at least one of the other branches of government. Hopefully that makes sense to you. All right, good luck.